Hi guys, this is Tiber here, and in this video I'm going to talk about how to farm for the secret Goblin Nightmare Dungeon, also known as the Treasure Breach Affix on Nightmare Dungeon Sigils. Now I believe that many of you might not have heard about this at all, since a Treasure Breach Nightmare Dungeon Sigil is the rarest item in Diablo 4 Season 9, so I will explain. If you open a Nightmare Dungeon with the sigil having the Treasure Breach affix, then the Nightmare Dungeon will have additionally a large number of different goblins inside of it. So you will be able to get a lot of extra loot from that Nightmare Dungeon. Additionally, it's not only the simple plain Nightmare Dungeon sigils are the ones that can have this affix, but the affix can appear on escalating Nightmare Dungeon sigils, or it can also appear in a single layer of an escalating Nightmare Dungeon. So this is how you might encounter Treasure Breach. However, due to its rarity, it's likely that you have not encountered it at all. And now let's talk about how to farm it. But first of all, a fair warning. Farming a Treasure Breach Nightmare Dungeon sigil takes a lot of time, and even more importantly, in my opinion, it is not worth the time spent on farming. Why? The amount of goblins that you get inside the Nightmare Dungeon is decent, however the loot that they drop is nothing special. You can farm the same loot from different sources with much less time investment. So if you want ancestral uniques, then you can farm the pits. If you want Obdusite, then you can farm Nightmare Dungeons or Horadric Strongrooms with much less time investment, whereas getting a Treasure Breach Nightmare Dungeon sigil can take hundreds of hours. You have been warned. Let's go. Since any dungeon sigil can have the Treasure Breach affix, your job is to get as many dungeon sigils as possible, as fast as possible. And there are a few ways to do that. First, you should have a character that is able to speed farm dungeons. So for example, a permanent teleport sorcerer or an evade spiritborn. And with this character, you should just speed farm nightmare dungeons over and over again. You get a new Nightmare Dungeon sigil at the end of the dungeon, so you will be constantly getting a new sigil every, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes, depending on which dungeon we're talking about and how fast your character can clear it. And this way, every 3 to 5 minutes, you have a chance for a Treasure Breach affix. You can do the same for escalating Nightmare Dungeons. So if you have an escalating Nightmare sigil, then you can speed farm the escalating Nightmare Dungeon, and you have a chance of getting the Treasure Breach affix for each layer of the escalating Nightmare Dungeon. In this case, you have to do strong rooms because you will lose the escalating Nightmare sigil at the end. So in order to be able to continuously farm escalating Nightmare Dungeons, you have to do the Horadric strong rooms that you encounter inside, and this way you'll be able to replenish your escalating Nightmare Dungeon sigils. Now both of these routes can be done in a group, and if you are able to get a group, then I recommend doing it, because farming is faster in a coordinated group, and you only have to use one Nightmare sigil when you are opening a dungeon, so not everybody in the group has to use one. If you manage to get some excess Nightmare Dungeon sigils that you are not going to use, then I recommend salvaging them at the Occultist and crafting new ones. And each new crafted Nightmare Dungeon sigil has a chance to have the Treasure Breach affix. I believe that salvaging a Nightmare Dungeon sigil will give you 15 sigil powder, regardless of the type, and in order to craft one, it costs 60 Nightmare Dungeon sigils. So again, if you've got any excess Nightmare Dungeon sigils, I recommend salvaging them and crafting new ones at the Occultist. In addition to farming dungeons, there are other options for you to farm the Treasure Breach Nightmare sigil. However, these are all worse in my opinion. All of these involve farming sigil powder instead of actual Nightmare Dungeon sigils, and all of these grant barely any sigil powder. Theoretically, you could farm whisper caches which contain sigil powder, and the whisper caches sometimes also contain sigils themselves. However, I believe that this farm is slower than farming the sigils by clearing Nightmare Dungeons. If you are interested in getting something else from the whisper caches, then of course it is different, but purely for farming the treasure breach, I do not recommend farming whisper caches. Another possible sources for sigil powder would be the Helltide, because Helltide chests contain sigil powder, and theoretically open world events also grant you some sigil powder. But these sources, such as the whisper caches, Helltide, and open world events, I would not recommend farming for the treasure breach because of the low amount of sigil powder you get even in the highest difficulty. So all in all, if you want to get your hands on a treasure breach Nightmare Dungeon sigil, then you should farm Nightmare Dungeons or escalating Nightmare Dungeons with a speed farm build, possibly in a group. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very rare item, and realistically it will most likely take hundreds of tries until you get it, and the rewards are not worth it in my very own opinion. And that's it. This is how you farm the new Goblin Nightmare Dungeon in Diablo 4 Season 9. If you found this video useful, then you might want to check out one of my other videos about how to get a Resplendent Spark every 2 to 3 hours in Diablo 4 Season 9 repeatedly. Thank you for watching. See you guys next time. Thanks.